Good afternoon, political scientists, for the third attempt at recording this, but you don't need to worry about that one. Welcome back, by the way. I'm sorry that the first lesson back was essentially text and referring to a previous video I'd already made, and therefore this is my first proper interaction with you, I suppose. I hope you all had a good half term. I did. I had a lovely relaxing time, and I hope you're also feeling more relaxed, even though you've got an assessment on. So relaxed-ish, relaxed adjacent. We're moving on, and what we're going to talk about today is how you could describe a Prime Minister as being presidential. Now, the first thing I need to point out very, very quickly is that this will become more apparent when we do the US political stuff in Unit 3, and when we're talking about POTUS, the President of the United States, and their role, and I'll make that point in a moment. This debate, when I first started teaching politics, was a new debate. Well, new-ish, and a lot of the ideas behind it were quite specific. Nowadays it's a bit more nuanced and there's a bit more of a history to it because it's become a thing we talk about. So, although they cannot be presidents, they can be described as presidential. And how does that even work? So, let's discuss that. How presidential are prime ministers? Now, the first thing to point out is what we're not talking about. We're not talking about the constitutional powers of a prime minister, because constitutionally they're not a president. They are a prime minister, primus inter pares, first among equals. Their constitutional powers don't really exist. They have some powers gifted by their role and function and their connection to the Queen and the fact that she's invited them to form a government, but they cannot be, under our constitutional arrangement, a president. It simply cannot happen. Where they get their power from is partly to do with this. A lot of the powers that they gain as head of state are gifted from the Queen when she invites them to form a government. She can take them back at any time, and often does. And that means that the Prime Minister has no independent source of power beyond any other MPs. Other MPs are elected the same way in a general election, and so, regardless of their majority within their own constituency, a Prime Minister doesn't have more authority or legitimacy than any other MP. That's the primus inter pares part, the first among equals. Furthermore, the principle of collective ministerial responsibility means that they don't have the power of government either. In the United States, a president can take credit for things that go well in their cabinet, because at the end of the day, the cabinet does not really exist outside the person of the Prime Minister. Whereas, in the UK, a Prime Minister has ministers who can take credit for things that happen in their department. To wit, take Nadeem Zahawi, the Minister for Vaccination. Despite the fact that in that post he has done precisely nothing, organisationally, bureaucratically, or indeed leadership-wise, he has literally done nothing. He's still able to take the credit for the successful rollout of the vaccination. Of course he has. That's what we understand our government to do. He's head of a department, the department has done things, and the department has essentially left it to the NHS, and it worked. So of course he gets to take credit for that. But note how it's not Boris Johnson's credit. It's not the Prime Minister's credit. It's Nadeem Zahawi's credit. Similarly, when Matt Hancock is found to be acting unlawfully and handing out PPE contracts, that's not Johnson's issue. It's Hancock's issue. Collective ministerial responsibility essentially means that we have a whole government that deals with things, and a whole group of people that we refer to and we expect to take responsibility for various aspects of government. Contrast that with the US, and you have a president who takes responsibility for all of his cabinet's decisions. We don't necessarily even know who his cabinet people are. Whereas in this country we do, and several people use this as an argument that Boris Johnson led a cabinet government because you know the names of other people in the cabinet and they take decisions independently, though I quibble that. I'm not entirely sure that they do. Furthermore, when it comes to general elections, the Prime Minister is not free, like a president is, to rely on their personal authority to be elected. For example, James Callaghan called a general election and, despite large public opinion in his favour, still lost the 1979 general election. Equally, when the Conservatives found that their polling data showed that Thatcher was no longer an electoral asset in 1990, they forced her out as party leader and thus as Prime Minister. That was a party getting rid of her, and with Callaghan, it was Parliament getting rid of him. In both cases, they simply did not have the personal authority or the personal legitimacy to stop those decisions. Unlike, say, Donald Trump in 2020, declaring that he hadn't lost the election, and continuing a personal struggle into 2021, not quite ending with, but certainly with its low point, its nadir being marked as an attack by his supporters on Congress. That continues. That personal fiefdom is separate to any kind of political power enjoyed by a Prime Minister in the United Kingdom. And you see the differences. So we cannot talk about actual power. So what are we talking about? It's called style, dear. You wouldn't understand. Sorry, that's a quote from Fawlty Towers. Basil Fawlty puts a second hat on. I was toying with the idea of putting it in here, and if we were in the classroom, I probably would have done, but copyright issues. You can look it up yourselves if you want, but I'm not going to put it on here. Why is that surrounded by a blue box? Oh, because I've got that on it. Not surrounded by a blue box for you. So, the theory goes like this. The style of the Prime Minister means that they are practically, or pragmatically if you prefer, presidential. They can do as they wish, as a president would, even though constitutionally they don't have the same powers. So a Prime Minister will dominate their cabinet, and it doesn't really matter what the cabinet say, because at the end of the day, the final decision is the Prime Minister's. And we definitely saw that when we're talking about cabinet government and the phrase Tony wants, when we're talking about Tony Blair. You've seen that with the modern government, with Boris Johnson, and I'll come back to that later. But we've also seen it with others. The media, furthermore, obsess over the Prime Minister and his or her personal touch, and they tend to focus on the Prime Minister above government because it's easier. It's an individual. It's someone onto which you can pin things. So you're often told about Boris's opinion, or Boris will address the nation. The fact that we use the term Boris in the media is fascinating to me. It transforms Mr. Johnson from a Prime Minister into something else, and it's very presidential in style. I guess a bit like Trump. By the way, it's fascinating to note that in the US, many commentators refer to Boris Johnson as Mini Trump, and European ones too. Not so much in the UK, but there you go. What does this mean? It means that if you've got the relevant mix of charisma and influence coming together, then you can dominate decision-making in government, and you may as well be a president rather than simply a prime minister and the first among equals. That's just how it works. That's what happens. My first example is perhaps an odd one. I'm going to look at Harold Wilson, and I'm going to look at his use of the television. Now, he modelled it on what he saw from JFK, President Kennedy, between 1960 and 1963. JFK was the first television president, and he was able to connect with the people of the United States more than previous presidents because he was comfortable with TV cameras and he invited them into his life. And thus, he was so comfortable that he could give presidential addresses on television rather than going to Congress to do it there. Harold Wilson spotted what was going on, spotted that Macmillan and Douglas Home had failed to do that as Conservative prime ministers, and decided to outwit them, and became our first television prime minister. He was not unaware of the power that gave him, and he never passed up a publicity stunt. So here I've got a picture of him with the Beatles, but he also took the opportunity to be photographed with stars of things like Coronation Street, thus identifying himself with what we call the zeitgeist, the feeling of the time. And it fitted in. He seemed modern, he seemed approachable in a way that previous prime ministers were not. And he sowed the seeds of a presidential style. He gave himself a bit of space. He was separate to and from the Labour Party in people's imaginations. The whole of the Labour Party didn't get a picture with the Beatles. Harold Wilson did. And this leads us to something that Michael Foley, a political writer, referred to as spatial leadership. That is, the ability to put a bit of mental space between yourself, your party, and even your government in the popular imagination. If the prime ministers are distant from their political parties and distant from the cabinet, then they behave in a much more presidential style. There's more room for them to create characters to play. Harold Wilson was the first, but he was by no means the last to try this. To some extent, you could argue that every prime minister since then has employed this to some degree. But cultivating and creating that personal mandate based on your connections and the cultural zeitgeist that you're able to marshal for your own image is easier said than done. And very few people are capable of that kind of thing. My first example to prove a point is going to be the role of the media, though. Now, the media themselves tend to focus on the individual. Check out the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They focus on the individuals more than any of the organizations that they set up. There are no forces of history here. There are no social constructs. Everything is about individual decision-making. The key moments in the entire set of films is when they fall out and argue over how they're going to do things. And then they proceed as a team only after each individual has had their story arc completed, or if not completed, moved into the right direction. We watch the individuals. We have a cult of celebrity. We like the stories of people. We're not interested in why they are where they are. We're interested in their person. I mean, look at X Factor. You always have the sob story. Oh, I've dreamed of this for so long. And let's ignore the fact that they're a white middle-class person who had time to go to music lessons. Do you see what I mean? So we focus on the individual. And the first clip I'm going to show you, the focus on the leadership rather than the government, in other words, in media. Obviously, media do what works. They're in it for the viewing figures. And what works is individual stories. So they treat the Prime Minister as an individual, as a celebrity, as someone who can impose their personal will. And when they can't, the media criticise them because that's what they want. Now, Thatcher and Tony Blair were very good at this, and so is Johnson, but I'm going to come to him later. Let's start with Thatcher. The clip I've got here, the link is in the description below, is when she's being interviewed on the 5th of April 1982 about her decision to send a task force to fight the Argentinians for the ownership of the Falkland Islands. And, well, go and watch it and listen carefully to her tone and her use of language. If you're interested, on page 206 in the textbook, you will find a transcript. Now, the transcript is of the interview she gave to ITN, and I can't find that for free on YouTube. I'm imagining it's behind a paywall somewhere. The one I found is the clip from BBC Newsnight, which is similar, but not exactly the same as the text you have in the textbook. But listen carefully to how she reads that text. Compare the two. You'll notice I've got a timestamp there. You are welcome to watch the whole thing, but it's just that small bit. You'll know when it's over because you'll reach the end of the quote. So read that quote, go watch the video now. I'm going to assume you've had a chance. What you see there is someone who's very, very good at what they do. She was able to very effectively use her voice. Notice how it dropped. I'm talking very quietly, in a very British way, about success. And the I am talking in a British way. She identified herself as the avatar of the entire country. She was, in the moment, public opinion. And she didn't mention my government. She didn't say the Conservatives. She didn't even say the British government or the British people. She said, I. And that's fascinating. That's very presidential in style. Tony Blair is our other example, and what I have here is 1997. Again, it's on page 206, and you can find the clip of the speech that they've decided to print. Now, I've not done a timestamp on this one. If you go to this, you'll notice there's about 35 seconds of dead time. It's just Blair walking. And what I find interesting is that's how it was broadcast at the time. No one put commentary in, no one spoke over it. Now, it's from AP News, rather than from a news channel because the quality was higher. There are lower quality versions out there from the British News, from BBC News and from ITN. But this one I chose because it's the highest quality version. But no one spoke over those first 35 seconds, which in itself is interesting on how the media treat prime ministers as celebrities in their own right. Now, when you watch it, it takes them about a minute to get to the quote you'll find on page 206. So it's about a minute 35 seconds in, I think, when he gets to that point. But it's worth watching the whole thing because it's a very personal and a very first-person response. Now, I know you guys use first-person in your essays, and I always say to use the academic passive. And here you see the difference. When you're writing an essay, you're not trying to convince people that you're the lightning rod of an opinion or that you are identifiable and approachable. You're using it to make an academic point. The first person is incredibly powerful, and here you see just how incredibly powerful it can be. But also I hope you'll see how this doesn't work for an essay. It's a very different kettle of fish. But go and watch it. It's about 3-4 minutes long in total, and it's well worth watching. Go watch. Okay, I'm going to assume you've watched that now, and you've seen the power of the personal and how Blair uses it. And this makes him an incredibly interesting example. He is the example, being the first city in human history, capital U. So he's the example of a presidential prime minister. When I was starting to teach politics, he was the only example when people were talking about is the prime minister becoming more presidential. No one mentioned Wilson, no one mentioned Thatcher, and that I found fascinating. As I say, it's become a bit more nuanced. So he is the apogee, the closest we get to a presidential prime minister in the popular imagination. He is more presidential than Thatcher, more presidential than Harold Wilson, though you can trace it back through those two premiers. Now, I've mentioned Johnson being successful. I'll come back to him later. There's also the rhetoric. I keep going on about this personal and moral and first-person use. Well, Blair does this again. When he was making the case... So, first of all, you've got the media treatment of his intervention. So in the Northern Ireland peace process, when Blair got involved and literally jetted back and forth, that made a difference, and it made it more serious for the TV news because Blair was involved. Let's forget that Mo Mowlam was doing it for years. Let's forget the multiple years of government talks from Thatcher through Major that set up what Blair inherited. Let's forget the individual activism from individual MPs bringing things like the IRA to the table. Blair made it important for the news media, and so Blair became associated with the Good Friday Agreement and the eventual solving of the Northern Ireland problem. Now, whether or not he was personally involved is almost entirely irrelevant. He turned up to meetings, the news reported on him, it was a big deal, like he was a president, rather than a leader of a cabinet. Do you see what I mean? When it came to the war in Iraq in 2003, he actually bypassed Parliament entirely. Now, the clip I've got for you there, link in the description below, if you click on it, it was as he did it. He did a TV address to the nation. He did not announce it in Parliament. This is how he announced the invasion of Iraq. Go and watch it. It's really interesting. And I'm assuming that as you watched it, you spotted his use of the first person, you spotted his use of his own morals, you spotted the way in which he spoke directly to camera, you spotted the way in which he personalised not only the decision-making, but the responsibility for the decision-making. The entire war was his personal project. It was quite effective. Although the war was unpopular, this TV address did stop people protesting, and it allowed people to park their concerns and let it happen. It essentially allowed it to go away for a bit, until 2007, I think it was, with the Chilcot inquiry, or possibly even later. So Blair's use of the personal and the media's response to him as a personal user, a celebrity, if you will, is powerful. And you can see why he is seen as the example to go to when you're talking about the presidential style of a prime minister. Because that's what he did. That's the sort of thing we expect from a US president. But it's not just limited to Blair. Those that followed him, like David Cameron, for example, used a similar style. Now, David Cameron didn't have the same charisma, and certainly didn't bypass Parliament as much. But the clip I've got there, link in the description, is a 50-odd second clip from Channel 4 News around the time of gay marriage being granted. And you'll notice that he talks about his personal conviction more than he talks about a government position. In fact, he mentions once or twice the situation in Parliament and how some Conservative MPs won't support him. It doesn't seem to matter. It's his personal conviction that pushes through, and indeed it worked. The reason we got gay marriage when we got gay marriage is because of David Cameron's decision that it was going to take place. That is very presidential. He's using public opinion and his avatar, him being public opinion, to whip his MPs and Parliament into shape. And it kind of works. He does it again in the Indie Ref in 2014, and it works. The Indie Ref was in favour of staying, that's Scotland voting to be independent, and they voted to stay within the United Kingdom. And that was largely down to the personalisation that Cameron applied. He tried it again with the EU referendum in 2016, And it utterly failed because he personalised it. A lot of people, and this is backed up by a lot of evidence, voted against what he was proposing, regardless of what it was. They wanted to school the government. They wanted to teach them a lesson. And that in itself is fascinating. So although he failed, the failure implies that he's very presidential and that the country viewed him as presidential because they saw it as a personal whacking for him rather than a structural constitutional issue. And that in itself, well, is a powerful example of this idea of prime ministers being treated like presidents and using the style of presidents. There's also the way general elections work. General elections increasingly have become focused on leaders' debates since 2010, when the famous I Agree with Nick was done. And that personalised it with Gordon Brown and David Cameron and Nick Clegg. Cleggmania. The fact that the media focused so much on the leaders of the parties, and it was popular, meant that they did again in 2015, and they expanded the leaders' debates to include more parties, some of which were irrelevant on the national stage. So having a national debate involving Plaid Cymru and the SNP seemed a bit weird when you couldn't vote for Plaid Cymru or the SNP outside of Wales and Scotland, respectively. It seemed a bit of an odd choice. Farage being involved was an interesting one as well, even though his party was small. And so you get this focus on celebrity. As a consequence, David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, was very important to the media. And the leaders' debates in 2017 did a similar thing, arguably against Theresa Human Rights for Optional May, but that is how it works. Thus, you could argue that the cabinet is largely irrelevant, and you could look very clearly at Johnson versus Williamson on the 4th of January 2021. Earlier that day, Gavin Williamson, and indeed for much of December, had said that schools would go back on the 4th of January and they would stay back. There was no hint of schools being closed. It was not in his vocabulary. It was not something he was going to do. Furthermore, he absolutely guaranteed that exams were going to go ahead in the summer. Absolutely guaranteed it. And he was saying that right up until 8 p.m. when Boris Johnson made this weird statement. Now, I do apologise, this link is from The Sun, but I couldn't find another link, so I'm sorry. Anyway, go watch that link, it's very short, and just remember that Gavin Williamson, a member of Cabinet, has been saying publicly all day that schools will remain open and that exams will continue to be held in the summer. Go watch it. Now, I hope you noticed that Johnson utterly destroyed Williamson's reputation. He destroyed the idea that Williamson was in control of education on that day. And it's fascinating. Why? Because it's a presidential style. He was taking responsibility without checking with Cabinet. Indeed, Cabinet had not signed off on anything he said at 8 p.m. on that Monday. It wasn't a meeting until the following day. Basically, they got to say they agreed. And that wasn't the first or only time. It happened again in August when Williamson was forced to back down over the algorithm. So you see this a lot. Boris Johnson is incredibly presidential in the sense that he ignores his cabinet and often hangs them out to dry. The cabinet, in many ways, can be seen as irrelevant. This example spoke to me because I saw it happen, and I thought it was a useful one to pass on to you. There are others, like closing borders or vaccinations or PPE. This one was the one that was the easiest one for me to trace, being involved in education. And as you're also involved in education, I thought it would be more germane to your experience. Furthermore, there's been a creation of new bodies, new groups within politics. So under Tony Blair, there was created a Chief of Staff. That's a very US-sounding phrase, not accidentally. It is a US-sounding phrase. The US have Chiefs of Staff that run offices for the President, except we've got one that runs it for the Prime Minister. Recently, Boris Johnson has appointed a personal, someone that does the media for them, a PA, if you will, a personal assistant, Allegra Stratton, and she seems to have incredible power, getting rid of Dominic Cummings. That's quite powerful, given how powerful Dominic Cummings was, getting rid of a Chancellor of the Exchequer in the form of Sajid Javid. So that would imply that the office of the Prime Minister is more powerful than offices within the Cabinet, and indeed more powerful than the Prime Minister's friends and colleagues, which is fascinating. There is a PM's private office. There is a Cabinet office, both of which have been created under Blair, expanded, strengthened under Cameron and May, and now under Johnson are being used almost as the corridors of power, making a presidential style, because the Prime Minister, bear in mind, has no extra authority. They just have extra control and power. So what are the limits? How can you stop a Prime Minister being presidential? Well, the first is the character of the Prime Minister. Major, for example, had a very collegiate approach from 1990 onwards, and that initially was very deliberate because he wanted to be a very obvious deviation from Thatcher. That's what they wanted. That's what the people said they wanted. But after his electoral victory, just in 1992, he kind of lost his sheen, and as a consequence, because he wasn't very good at being a personal Prime Minister, the media deserted him. He was lampooned for being weak and boring in things like Spitting Image, and I could have done multiple clips, but I figure, yeah, you probably don't need to see those. You just get the idea that he's not very good at being a presidential Prime Minister. It's one of the reasons he's in my box, because he's not a presidential Prime Minister. He was a manager. I said myself earlier, he's a middle manager. Brown and Bremner. Now, Brown, Golden Brown, Texture-like Sun, was the Prime Minister. Rory Bremner was a well-known humorist and satirist who would do, what do you call them? Not interviews, impressions, thank you. And so if you click that link in the description below, you will see basically Bremner taking the piss out of Gordon Brown. And he does very effectively. Go and watch it. It's amusing and it's worth a watch, and you might need to know some cultural background, but I'm sure that Susan Boyle is still well known to you. She was a surprise winner of X Factor. She was obviously a very troubled lady who found fame through her voice and was then largely exploited. But interestingly, a lot of people loved her because, oh yeah, against adversity, and, well, she was from Scotland. So is Gordon Brown. So, Rory Bremner, destroying Gordon Brown. Go have a watch. And that sort of thing stuck. One of his own cabinet, what's the quote, said that he was like a wet weekend in Fife, in that he was boring, difficult to deal with, full of adversity. The media cottoned on to the idea that he had antidepressants and went absolutely for him on that, which was really unfair, but there you go. The image I've got down, literally below me here, is an image of Gordon Brown getting angry that was all over the press because it showed the real man. There was that time he was caught on a hot mic talking about a racist woman, calling her a racist woman, and that just went explosive because how dare he call this woman racist? She was the typical Labour voter, and therefore he was turning against his own supporters. I mean, she was racist. She was haranguing him about immigration when he'd gone to do something else. So, and the way she did it was racist, not just, oh, I'm worried about immigration. It was the way she was worried about immigration. He wasn't wrong. But the media really went for him because he was no longer approachable. He was no longer a man of the people. He just wasn't very good at being charismatic. His character wasn't right. And then you've got Theresa human rights are optional, May. Below Brown on my sidebar here, you've got that moment in her in a conference speech where a letter fell off behind her, building a change that works for everybody. And then the letters fell down. A country that works for everybody, it wasn't working. And then she started coughing. She tried to pull it back. There it is. Yeah, Brown and the economic crisis meant that he was never going to be able to push that personal view. Sorry, I've forgotten that bit. Brown and the economic crisis in 2007, 2009, there wasn't a lot he could do about that. And it meant that he couldn't, the situation, events, dear boy, events, I guess, prevented him from being a presidential-style prime minister. He wasn't able to. Though many of the decisions he made, he justified with first-person language. The media didn't see it that way. and so they didn't treat him like a president. Although he did almost exactly the same as what Barack Obama did, and Barack Obama got lauded for what he did. By the way, Barack Obama copied the UK version. It wasn't seen like that. The international crisis was very personalised, and he was previously the Chancellor, and so the media almost decided that he wasn't worth talking about in a presidential manner. The entire government got blamed. May and Brexit meant that May was never really going to be a presidential-style Prime Minister. The textbook says that she started out that way, and certainly she tried, but I always found it weird because it didn't look like it was ever going to stick. She did one thing. She made very grandiose-sounding speeches using a lot of I's that flew in the face of what she was actually doing as part of her government, and she did it very calculatedly. So it seemed to me, and perhaps this is down to my mug, that she was never going to be presidential. She could never be taken seriously as a personal prime minister because she didn't have the courage of her convictions. This is her attempt, I think this one, is the attempt to own that when she was filmed dancing and then she came in doing the Dancing Queen. And this one is the coughing speech. Have a look at both of those clips. I think I've got those the right way around. Have a look at both of those clips because they show how her attempt to be a personal presidential-style prime minister were doomed to failure. She just couldn't do it. Have a look at those. I mean, the dancing is cringeworthy, isn't it? And the coughing. Oh dear. I mean, she tries to own it. She tries to make light, but it's just weird. And that focus on celebrity from the media meant that she could never be presidential. She could only be lampooned. She got called the Maybot and was talked about as being malfunctioning. And after 2017, even former colleagues in the media that liked her turned on her and destroyed her. So what about Johnson? Now, you'll notice these points are almost exactly the same as when I was talking about why prime ministers win, because they are exactly the same as why prime ministers win. But what I'm going to focus on this time is how Johnson uses the media. Why is he so good at it? Well, he's a former journalist, and he understood as a journalist how basically to get readers, and he understood how to make news stories. So when you look at these things, like his ownership of Brexit in 2019, his personal power in early 2020, understand it from the point of view that you're looking at someone who understands how the media works, who used to be in the media, and understand that from the beginning, Johnson has massaged his presidential position as Prime Minister. These things are not events anymore, they're deliberate uses of events by a Prime Minister that knows what he's doing. Calling it the Christmas Brexit, I mean, that's genius. And it was done by him first, not the media. The vaccination programme, his personal association with it, visiting that vaccination centre, talking about, making that remark about how he felt like O.J. Simpson, which is a really weird joke, but it guaranteed that people would report it, that people would report that Boris Johnson was at a vaccination centre. Boris Johnson is now associated on internet search terms with vaccination. It was the same when he did that bus in that weird interview. It got Boris Johnson's association with a failed bus company off the front page of Google search results, and instead put that interview when you type in Boris Johnson bus as the top result. Do you know what he was doing? I think he did. I think he does. Whatever else I say about him as being a bumbling Prime Minister, and I don't think he's a terribly good Prime Minister, he is incredibly good at using the media. And that makes him presidential in style. The events, dear boy, events, mean that Boris Johnson has managed to transform his premiership into something approaching Blair-like in how it is viewed by the media. And that might be our new example, our new go-to when talking about how presidential prime ministers are. Now, the textbook does not have the detail for Boris Johnson, for at the time, he was not the prime minister. But this is now over 30 minutes long, so give me a moment and I'll bring it to a close. It's 33 minutes long. I'm sure it's long enough for a lesson. We'll see how we go. Tomorrow I will set you a follow-up for this, an A4, not A3, sheet to fill in. I've preset the text font size. If you want to do it on the PowerPoint, you can. But ideally, you can print it off and fill it in. And we're going to use the case studies in the textbook. You'll notice, I'm just looking at the textbook now, from page 209 through to page 212, they've got 4 prime ministers as case studies about how presidential or not they were. And all I'm asking you to do is to thematize it, put it in another format so you can use it. And you'll notice I've included Boris Johnson, who is not in the textbook. I hope I've given you enough to chew on to make that work, but I'll talk more about that when I'm setting that as a lesson. So I hope this has been useful. My apologies for going over time. I'm now at almost 35 minutes. Have a lovely rest of day, and I shall see you tomorrow with a new video and probably a new topic soon. We're going to be moving on soon. So good luck with the assessments, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye now.